Thank you and welcome to OCASI's final plenary of the conference. It is a great pleasure to join you this afternoon. My name is Debbie Douglas and I'm the Executive Director of OCASI. OCASI acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to acknowledge my African ancestors, brought here as an enslaved people against their will over 400 years ago. I acknowledge and pay homage to the legacy of resistance they've bequeathed me and commit to continuing their solidarity with Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you your moderator for this afternoon's session, Faiza Abdillawi. Faiza is a recognized member of the Francophone community in Canada and a passionate agent of change. She is the founder and director of Next Level Impact Consulting. Faiza has significant experience supporting not-for-profit organizations, corporations, governments, and citizens, especially women, immigrants, and entrepreneurs in their economic development through consulting, program development, and evaluation. Faiza is a 2017 Civic Action Fellow and is the past president of MOFIF, the Ontarian Movement of Francophone Immigrant Women, and a regular columnist for Radio Canada on personal finances. Faiza, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon, Debbie, and thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this discussion this afternoon. Bonjour également à nos partenaires francophones. Vous avez un canal qui vous est dédié. Je vous inviterai aussi pendant les introductions à aller télécharger la présentation en fait qui va être faite par Statistique Canada. Comme ça, vous aurez les informations en français devant vous. Before we start, and thank you, Debbie, for doing the land acknowledgement. It is a small but essential step toward truth and reconciliation. I would like to acknowledge also the land I live in, which is Mississauga, and I personally invite you to do so yourself and also reflect deeply on what it means for those of us who are recent newcomers. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabited. Today marked my 12th year in Canada, and I want to stress out that many of us immigrants come from previously colonized or colonizing countries, and that it is in our hands to participate in the reconciliation or by learning, educating, and supporting actively groups and organizations across the country working towards reconciliation and improving the lives of Indigenous people, to empower them, to help them live healthily, to parent healthily, and to break cycles of violence, poverty, and abuse. It is especially crucial in this post-pandemic world that we live in right now, as its effects have been and are disproportionately experienced by Indigenous and Black women and women that are othered because of race, ethnicity, gender identity, immigration status, and more. How can we ensure that a post-pandemic recovery is including all, and especially women? That is the question we are asking to our five panelists, bringing each one strong and relevant analysis, perspective, and recommendation for designing and implementing economic and social solutions to this crisis like no other before. After painting a portrait of the situation, discussing some of the policies needed, and specificities around sectors and groups, we will take questions from you, from the audience, virtually connected with us today from all over Canada. So please use the Q&A section to ask, comment, and share to make these 2 hours as interactive as possible. Our first panelist that I want to introduce is at the core of these efforts to raise awareness on the she session that we are living. You actually formulated the concept of C-session, Armin, She-Covery, back in May, and we've seen them now on every reports and as an umbrella word on attempts to answer the crisis that is taking, on your own words, gender equity in the labor force backward by decades. Thank you for joining us, Armin Yalnizyan. You are economist with the Atkinson Foundation. We also have Brittany Andrew-Amofah. You are Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Broadband Institute. Your primary focus is on engaging and you strive actually to empower those who've been excluded and disenfranchised from the Canadian political system due to system racism, colonization, and the concentration of power to become involved in the political process by providing accessible political information. That's certainly what you will do with us this morning. We also have Tsering Tsomo, who's the Director of the Employment and Training Department of the YWCA Toronto. And because you are also the current co-chair of the OCASI Women's Caucus, Tsering, that gives you a unique view of what is happening within the women organization and the women's sector, and what to do to equip women with the skills and knowledge for the Canadian labor organization market to transform rapidly. Cassandra Cordero, you are joining us from British Columbia, where you are the Director of Equity and Human Rights for the BC Federation of Labor, and you are passionate and truly committed to address the issues around race and class, migrant justice, and Indigenous rights. And finally, Li Shu, Director of Social Analysis and Modeling at Statistic Canada, leading the current efforts of the institution to support research on social economical issue, including immigration, a topic that you know very well as you worked previously at IRCC. Those data really are crucial to inform a situation, to make visible specific issues visible, to make the invisible visible, and allows the different actors that we are to identify the driving forces behind those data. So Lee, we are starting with you as you will walk us through data revealing the social impact of the pandemic on immigrants, visible minorities, and Indigenous people. Thank you, Lee.
So as Faiza just introduced, so today my presentation basically will be focusing on some major economic and also social developments since the pandemic, but also focusing on the uneven impacts on certain population groups. So I'm trying to paint a really quick backdrop for today's discussion. Okay, so First, let's look at industry differences in workforce composition actually before the pandemic. So prior to COVID, immigrants and also visible minorities are overrepresented in certain industries, including frontline essential services and also including in long-term care as well. And this trend has continued during the COVID. If you look at the chart, so that's the pre-pandemic situation, but also we know from the numbers during the pandemic, also we see overrepresentation of the such workers in this critical industry. So the COVID also revealed differences in the nature of work across industries as well, with certain industries being very conducive to telework, but with other industries being dependent on person-to-person interactions. As you'll see, these differences actually have exacerbated pre-existing inequality. So not all industries can conduct their business online. The tourism industry actually is an example where telework is very limited, and also person-to-person interactions are very key. So, and this industry also happens to be the one where women immigrants are overrepresented. So So of course, so that you will see the vulnerability when the economic lockdown comes. So the immediate employment impact of the pandemic in April actually reflected this pre-existing inequality in telework capacity. So this slide actually shows the immediate impacts and also the some of the trends in terms of recovery for different groups. And so partly as a result of those pre-existing inequalities, the impact of the pandemic on some groups has been greater. So we could see from the employment data, use less educated workers, women, and also recent immigrants were more affected by the pandemic. If we look at the women in particular, they lag behind men during the recovery phase. Let's look at immigrants specifically. So Canadian evidence actually, like previously already suggested, immigrants are often more severely affected by economic downturns than the Canadian-born. So for example, during the 2008-2009 recession, immigrants, in particular recent immigrants, were much harder hit than the Canadian-born. And this negative impact actually was very persistent. So numbers during the pandemic and the partial recovery in June, in July, actually echo this pattern. So recent immigrants were much more likely than Canadian-born workers to move out of employment in March and April. And in particular, if we look at the female recent immigrants, they are worst affected. And in June and July, so that's the partial recovery. So we also see female recent immigrants had very low rates of transition from non-employment back to employment. And this gap was likely driven by differential employment growth between recent immigrants and the Canadian-born women by industry sectors and also wage levels. For example, from April to July, recent immigrant women lagged behind the Canadian-born women in employment growth in the accommodation and food service sector. So, so this is a huge gap actually we observed since the pandemic. And looking at visible minorities, actually we see a very similar picture. So prior to COVID, visible minorities are also overrepresented in the food accommodation sector, which are worst affected by the pandemic. And also several visible minority groups are most impacted. For example, like Blacks, Southeast Asian, Arab, if we measured by much higher unemployment rates. So those groups are also overrepresented in low-wage jobs, both before and also during the COVID. So I also want to highlight this added financial vulnerability to the discussion, because we see sometimes, so different groups may have very similar economic impacts in terms of job loss, but those economic impacts can have very much greater financial implications for visible minorities, partly due to their pre-existing financial vulnerabilities. So for example, prior to COVID, most visible minority groups were more likely to live in poverty than the white population. And also, since visible minorities often have lower incomes and also more precarious employment than the white population, their ability to buffer the income losses due to work interruptions is likely more limited. So StatsCan's crowdsourcing data confirm this added vulnerability. So among the crowdsourcing participants who were employed prior to the economic lockdown, So the COVID pandemic actually generally had a stronger impact on visible minority participants' ability to meet financial obligations or essential needs than for white population. So Indigenous people actually are another group most affected economically by the pandemic. So from the same crowdsourcing data I just mentioned, so among those employed prior to the pandemic, Indigenous participants were more likely to experience job loss or reduced hours, and to report a strong or moderate impact on their ability to meet financial obligations or essential needs, so compared to non-Indigenous participants. Indigenous women, if we look at the chart showed here, so Indigenous women were worse affected on both measures. And this larger financial impact on Indigenous participants is likely resulting from greater pre-existing vulnerabilities, again, so such as lower income levels, higher proportions living in poverty, and experience food insecurity. So while so far, so my numbers are mostly focusing on economic impacts, there is also evidence showing compounding health, in particular like mental health concerns among diverse groups. So prior to COVID, immigrants generally reported very similar levels of positive mental health compared with a Canadian-born. But if we look at the numbers from like the post-COVID or during the COVID, we see worse mental health results for immigrants and also visible minorities. In particular, like recent female immigrants, they are more likely than their male counterparts to report anxiety and also stress. So this lower mental health actually reflects in part the economic impacts and also concerns, as we already saw like previously that those groups are also most economically impacted. For women, especially working mothers, I'd like to highlight a particular concern, which is their ability to balance childcare, school, and work. So from the August labor force survey data, actually we see the gender gap in employment recovery among parents remained at 5 percentage points. Employment among fathers was almost fully back to pre-pandemic February level, compared to only 95% for mothers. And also among parents who have adapted to the COVID by beginning to work from home, about 1/3 were concerned that a return to their normal work condition would bring challenges in terms of childcare or caregiving. However, so among teleworking mothers with young children, so over half of them actually were citing this concern. So I will leave it here, so as a quick backdrop painting, but looking forward, still, we don't know like what the recovery will look like, nor do we know what long-term implications of COVID on the Canadian labor market, and also what they may mean for those diverse groups. But StatsCan definitely will continue evaluating and also measuring this as we build our data and also analytical programs. And back to you, Faiza.
Thank you so much, Lee, for all the numbers that you just presented and for the effort that it represented for Statistic Canada to really go deeper actually in the realities of those specific group. We can really measure the power that those numbers, these analyses that you're bringing will have when it comes to advocating for programs, advocating for the clients and the people, the folks that we are serving actually. So for those who are looking at this presentation and being maybe overwhelmed by all the numbers, you presented the main conclusion of it, but please, all of you, go on the interface that we have as participants. You can download these information, and we're sure that you're going to spend a lot of time with your team talking about it and seeing how it reflects for you and how it can help you again to advocate. Statistic Canada, Lee, you said from the beginning of COVID, saw the importance of those numbers, and we're really grateful for you to have done all this work. So we can start now discussing not only those numbers, because yes, it's a new thing for some of us, but just the reality that we were seeing pre-pandemic and now the impact of it. My first question is for you, Armin. Through your work, and since I've seen online amazing interview from you, very strong interview from you back in 2009, where you were analyzing the previous economic crisis, the change of the workforce, the place of the women in this workforce. You work also directly advising the government on gender-based, with a gender-based analysis lens. Armin, were you really surprised by the impact of this crisis on women, and how do we recover it? How do we recover from it? Very early in May already, you said there is no recovery without a she-covery. What do you mean by this exactly?
What I mean, and by the way, thank you very much for having me part of this remarkable panel of women, and following in the footsteps of Lee's great presentation. This is the first She session in history. It is not unique to Canada what's happening, it is unique to the pandemic. Throughout the 20th century, every recession has been a he session. In other words, men, usually blue collar workers in the goods producing industries of manufacturing, construction, mining and quarrying, forestry and fishing, have lost their jobs first. They tend to be better paid jobs than service sector jobs, but the jobs that first come back in the wake of recession have been jobs that women have been more eager to pick up to stabilize household income, because men have a higher reservation wage. They were earning more before, so they were less likely to want to grab a job in the service sector that could easily be at the minimum wage. Those were the first jobs that came back. This happens in the wake of every recession. Normally, the jobs that come back are an increase in demand for on-demand labor. So more sporadic, more service-related, and we need to keep our eye out for going forward. This recession was completely the inverse of history. So more women lost their jobs than men, than ever before in a recession. And more of those jobs were declared non-essential, and they were in the sectors that Lee was talking about: tourism, hospitality, which is bars and restaurants and accommodation, personal services like hair salons and nail salons and sports gyms and stuff like that. And critically, schools and childcare centers were shut down initially to contain the contagion. And those are female-dominated industries. So more women lost jobs than men initially, but the men caught up really fast. What was fascinating is when we started reopening up the job markets again around May or so, it was led by men recovering their jobs. So in the province of Ontario, where I live, the first jobs to open up were jobs in marinas, golf courses, gardening and hardware centers, all the guy jobs. They were the ones that came back first. And then over the course of the summer, we saw a reopening of bars and restaurants, which is female dominated, but lots of male jobs too. And then we get to September. So Lee's data end in August. By September, the She-Covery had caught up with the he-covery. But that is not likely to continue going forward, because that was a combination of the schools reopening, which brought back a lot of female employment, and some childcare centers reopening. Now, the issue here is that a lot of parents are choosing not to enroll their kids in school because it's not clear, safe protocols. And though childcare centers may be open, capacity is down quite a bit for two reasons. parents are unwilling to take the risk of sending their kids back to school, to childcare. And workers are unwilling to go in and work at wages that are below those of zookeepers, which we've been saying for about half a century now. So very high risk employment with very little protection, and very high risk too high a risk for some parents to consider. Now, low wage workers can't afford this choice, but up the income spectrum, middle income families are seeing more women making the choice after discussing with their second partner, which is often a male, and often somebody that makes more money than them, to stay at home, to take care of the kids, and to help homeschool. 2 unpaid jobs that, to the extent that these women had jobs before, or were able to work from home, which, by the way, is only 40% of the population. Not everybody can work from home. And that's split between men and women. So there's some subgroup of people that can afford to stay at home and do the unpaid care work. That is what is going to set us back by decades. And that is entirely and completely due to policy incompetence of making sure that school reopening and childcare capacity was not cratered. So we are still relying on women doing the unpaid work. We are looking at a phenomenon. I was slapped down in the pages of the Financial Post a few weeks ago I was called a super spreader of the myth of she-cession. So I got an opportunity to respond on those pages with, a shitload of statistics. Not quite like Lee's statistics, but definitely a cascade of statistics that show that if women do not get back into the labor market, that will have a huge macroeconomic cascade on the entire market. So whether you have kids or not, you should worry that women with kids are not getting back into the labor market, because the more you constrain the purchasing power of more households, the less spending is what's going on in the economy. Household spending is the biggest driver of GDP. So if you're actually preventing people from having enough money to spend and spending it, or constraining it by policy inadequacy, it's the same governments that want to reopen the economy that are doing this. They're dropping the ball, right? So they say they want the economy to recover, but everything else they're doing, they're just relying on the market. Like you turn on a light, the market is open. Well, that's going to help everybody. No, what we've discovered because of the pandemic is that the essential economy relies on the caring economy. And the caring economy is both paid and unpaid, and women do most of it. But we also, going into the pandemic, relied on half of our payroll, half of our employees were women. So if you take a whole bunch of people off payroll or reduce their hours, you're going to see a reduction in spending power. And that is going to be a macroeconomic drag. So we have a problem that is not just about women, it is about everyone. And just like COVID, how we deal with this is completely up to us. It's our choice how we deal with it. We can choose to rely on markets and do nothing about public policy, or we can choose to address these issues so that everybody can be functioning at their maximum potential. And there's a whole other piece of this that Lee touched on with respect to immigrant workers and people of color that work in low-wage industries. A lot of those jobs will not come back because they were marginal to begin with. But there's this policy amenable part to maximizing employment, which we are failing to put into place. And the longer we do that, more businesses will fail. So that's my hit.
Wonderful. And really in a few minutes, you show the complexity actually of the solution that has to be put in place. And what I keep really from all you said is also that too often policymakers think about women as a social issue, and it's actually an economic issue, as you showed, right? It's also consuming, and too often lately, I mean, in the last few years, we've seen that once we have this argument, this type of argument that women working are actually contributing to the global well-being, they seem to open their ears a bit more. You touched about childcare, you touched about the jobs. So it's 1.5 million women who lost their jobs. It's 1/3 of women, Canadian women, considering quitting their jobs right now, as you said, low income, also middle income. Brittany, those issues really, we seem to hear, we actually hear about them since decades. Childcare, pay wage, the sectors also that don't recognize the contribution of women, the issues also that immigrant women face in the workplace. What is your take on this? What do you see in your current work, in your thoughts about the actions of government? Do you think they're taking the right actions right now? Oh, you're muted, please. Thank you.
I want to say thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm very honored to be on this panel. So as Armin so eloquently pointed out, the caring economy has been the foundation of our economy for quite some time, and the neglect of investment into the caring economy, specifically childcare. But I would also extend that to our education systems as well, and our healthcare systems as well, is really showing throughout this pandemic. And it is a main reason why we're not going to have a robust, or I would say as careful as an economic recovery as we should, if we're not paying careful attention to these systems. But when it comes to, the sort of investments and sort of policies that we need to be thinking about as we move forward, I would say all eyes right now is on the federal budget. So the federal government laid out a number of what I would term as progressive policy commitments that will be required to have a robust economic recovery as we move throughout this pandemic, and as we see the light at the end of the tunnel. And some of those commitments included a national childcare and early learning system and program in place, but also, a number of the ones that include pharmacare, and then also investments in the green economy and infrastructure projects, et cetera. Looking at childcare specifically, this has been a long fight for childcare advocates for quite some time in terms of advocating for a national system. And right now, I would say the landscape is pretty ripe, really ripe, to have a national system of the sort. There's been, the buck has been passed between the feds and the provinces for quite some time in regards to who's responsible for implementing this. Where should the funding come from, whether it should come from the feds, whether it should be transferred to the provinces or territories, or whether provinces should be footing the entire bill. And I think we've all come to the consensus right now, which COVID has shown, that childcare should be viewed through a national priority lens, and that the federal government has an integral responsibility to step up to the plate and provide some sort of national, a national infrastructure program in collaboration with the provinces and territories. So again, all eyes are on the federal budget in terms of how this should be implemented and ensuring that the federal government follows through on this specific item. Again, it's extremely, extremely important, just not for getting women back into the workplace, but ensuring that people have a sense of trust and confidence in our childcare system to be able to trust that service when returning to work, and feeling safe, feeling that their kids will be safe while using this service. So I am very much, or the work that we're doing at the Institute is defer to Childcare Now strategy for implementing a national childcare program, which calls for a $2.5 billion investment upfront in collaboration with the provinces and territories to get this off the ground, and then investments over 10 years to ensure that we create fully public universal program, which should be the goal here. Childcare costs have been increasing over time. I'm in Toronto currently, which has some of the highest childcare costs in the country. And given the fact that COVID is creating an uncertain economy, this cost should be a priority to reduce or eliminate over time. So a universal childcare program is absolutely essential. But in addition to looking for funding investments, which we should be looking for in the upcoming federal budget, it is really, really critical to note that any creation of a national childcare program across the country has to come with legislation, or this program is, at risk of not even coming into fruition or even being eroded when different parties are to come into power. So the presence of legislation that outlines the right to childcare in this country is absolutely critical and something we should be looking for in this upcoming budget and something we should be advocating for. This legislation is currently present in Quebec, which enshrines the right that every child has a right to childcare. And this legislation has also been recently implemented in BC. So this is something that needs to be done on the federal level. It's something that will mimic something similar to the Canada Health Act that outlines 5 principles or a number of different principles in which childcare should be formulated around, that the provinces and territories will then, have the responsibility to help implement that. But as we move forward in regards to, what are some of the key things we should be looking at, right now is a key and important time for government spending. There's been a number of talk around, the increasing deficit and whether the government should be focusing on decreasing the deficit or if they should be focusing on investing programs and investing into the economy long term. And I would, the work that we're doing currently at the Institute is to ensure that funding investments continue to occur and that this fear of the deficit is actually quite misplaced. So I'm going to defer to yesterday's news article. The Bank of Canada stated that interest rates will remain at about 0.25% for probably the next few years, keeping interest rates low because of, the state of the Canadian economy, and that borrowing needs to occur to get our economy back on track. So this is a really, really critical time to lay out what are the funding priorities that the immigrant serving sector needs right now as it relates to services, as it relates to long-term programming, and as it relates to the protection of workers. So I would say right now is the time to go big, and it's the time to really claim and say what is absolutely necessary for immigrant women to thrive, at the very least, as we move forward into this economy and as we lay the groundwork for the future of our country post-pandemic. So I would say really laying out those priorities quite clearly and being very specific, I think is really key here, considering that spending is going to be absolutely crucial as we move forward. And then lastly, I just want to highlight, how COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted immigrant women workers, and Armin and Lee really laid that out quite extensively for us. But I would say now more than ever, it's absolutely important that we do continue to push back on anti-immigrant sentiment and racism, essentially, as it relates to workers. Migrant workers who do predominantly, I would say migrant workers that work in farms or the agricultural sector across our country is predominantly made up of men. However, migrant workers exist in long-term care homes. Precarious workers exist in a number of, or migrant precarious workers exist in a number of our caring sectors and economy, and they are right now receiving the brunt of job losses, lack of protection, lack of decent work, workplaces that are not unionized, et cetera, are facing even intimidation by workers. And again, unless we continue to sound the alarm, these experiences and these workers and what they're experiencing will be pushed by the wayside. So continuing to draw attention to these specific workers, I think is really critical. But as our economy continues to move forward, and Canada has not indicated that they will stop accepting immigrants during this time because they're absolutely essential. Immigrants and refugees and our international responsibilities to refugees are absolutely essential during this time. Because of the state of our economy, we're really at a really sensitive place where anti-immigrant sentiment can occur and become even worse. So I would say a huge part of our work is to ensure that anti-racism initiatives are continuing to be funded, employment equity legislation continues to come to the forefront, and community benefit projects are absolutely critical in this moment in time, especially as it relates to infrastructure projects, which will foreseeably be green infrastructure projects. And then ensuring that, immigrants and racialized women are a part of the creation of forming or the ideas around these projects. So I'm going to leave that here for now, but absolutely looking out for childcare, funding commitments, but also legislation that enshrines the right to childcare will be absolutely crucial in this upcoming budget.
Thank you so much, Brittany. What we can see from your introduction is really that as often in crisis, and especially this one, there is opportunities and risk. Opportunities to finally address the problems that women are facing, because we can't close our eyes anymore. The government, federal, provincial can't close their eyes. There is a huge downsides. I mean, it can be very dramatic, and we're finally seeing the link between the macroeconomics and the reality of the citizens. So we will see also, I guess, even if you stressed out the importance of the federal government, I think next week is the budget for the province of Ontario, where most of us are located right now. So we will see this, and definitely, as you mentioned, also the risk when there is crisis, when there is a poverty or increase of poverty, often the fingers are pointed even more on immigrants and others. So that's where the work, especially of women organization and the women sector, can come up to advocate and push the representative to implement the right policies and the right economic change and investment that has to be done, and also in supporting those populations. So to you, Tsering, definitely because you are working at YWCA Toronto, and also, as we said, you are co-chair in the Women's Caucus. How are you seeing this unfold within, like on the ground with the organization, and how can you relate probably their realities and the problem they're facing right now, the challenges they're facing, with what Armin and Brittany painted and Lee?
Thank you very much, Faiza, and really appreciate this opportunity to speak at this plenary. I just wanted to give some background in terms of both the YWCA Toronto as well as the OCASI Women's Caucus. So as many of you may know, the YWCA Toronto is the largest multi-service organization in Toronto. And we've been supporting women as well as trans and non-binary community members for many, many decades. The OCASI Women's Caucus, as some of you may know, was set up in 2018, and currently it has 38 women-focused or women-mandated organizations, which forms about 16% of the total OCASI membership. Obviously, the immigrant and refugee sector that we are speaking about primarily is a not-for-profit sector and is also a women majority sector. So 70 to 80% of our workforce is comprised of women. And despite being a contributor to the economy, not-for-profit sector wages are lower than other wages in large part because of the care penalty that we face. And within the sector also, I think women are also paid less than men, particularly in leadership positions. Definitely, we've seen the impact of COVID on our organizations as well as on our staff and on the women we serve. While many organizations in this sector are currently funded by both federal and provincial governments, we fortunately have not had to lay off any staff at this current time. However, I just was listening to the funder panel earlier in the earlier session, and I'm quite optimistic and encouraged to hear that many of the funders are hoping to maintain financial stability in the coming years as well. So really hope that continues and that we will not be penalized, particularly women's organizations will not be penalized for not meeting perhaps some of our targets and outcomes that we are mandated and are in our agreements. Having said that, I think really important to mention that within the women's organizations, there are other women's organizations that have different funding models. So there are women organizations that are very small. There are organizations with very limited resources, small with very limited resources. We also have women's organizations that have diverse revenue sources. So some of them really have had a major portion of their revenue coming through fundraising sources. Some of them also have fee-for-service revenue, such as childcare services or other sources of income, such as rental income. And these organizations particularly have been challenged during this pandemic. While their revenues have reduced, we know that the cost for running the organization, running the programs, have not reduced. In fact, it has increased as a result of the additional health and safety protocols that we are required and mandated to meet as well. In terms of our staff and our women participants, Amin and Lee and Brittany really spoke eloquently about some of the challenges with childcare, with elder care, with taking care of other responsibilities. Our participants and our women also, and our staff have also been impacted by them. Because of the absence of childcare or reduction of in-classes in school, women have had to, our staff and our participants have had to juggle from home, juggle between work from home as well as with family responsibilities. They've had to undertake perhaps double or triple duties, and unfortunately have been overworked with both unpaid and paid work. So that double whammy, so to speak, has really happened to many in our sector. And of course, this has impacted, as Lee had said, both on the physical, on the physical, on the emotional, as well as their mental health. The pandemic has also highlighted the tensions women's organizations face. So on one hand, while supporting team members who face similar challenges as the participants we serve, we also have at the same time had to ensure that we meet the program requirements. So there are targets, there are outcomes that our funders have mandated, and just sort of juggling, ensuring that we meet both of them has been a challenge for many of us. And, I've realized that as we do this, I think with women's organizations, they've really taken an empathic, a compassionate approach and have tried to delicately balance, the needs of both of these competing needs, I would say. For women's organizations, there are additional challenges because of the gendered aspect of caregiving. I would say that not many women who would normally come forward for employment or for have not been able to do so, as they are undertaking obviously many different caring responsibilities. Hence, unpaid work, I must say, for women has been a barrier to paid work. Similarly, many of our organizations in our sector have had to quickly pivot to a remote online method of service, and that has had some barriers in terms of the participants we serve. As many of you initially, some of them have not been able to access these remote services. There have been limitations because of technology, result of limitations to equipment, limitations to learning, having these skills to understand this, and so there has been a very obvious digital divide, among our participants as well, and also prioritizing the needs of their family members, particularly their children, who might need the same technology and equipment with their own personal needs as well. We've also realized that staff, while doing remote work, have actually taken longer to do some of these tasks that would normally take about half an hour or an hour, have now taken double the time, just because of the way we are right now operating. And I must say that, although we have pivoted to a remote learning, remote online service, I think quality services can still be best offered in person. So I think the fact that we've not been able to offer that in-person services to many marginalized, participants in our community really has been a setback for all of us. A result of COVID has also been that measures to contain illness as a result of closures and quarantines have also exacerbated the full contribution of our staff members. Even though, despite all these major challenges that I've just mentioned, women not-for-profit organizations have actually offered flexible arrangements to our staff. So that means that our team members can take care of, ensuring that they can take care of their children at the same time, can also complete the work and tasks, by offering flexible work arrangements while working from home or working from their office site. We've also offered work accommodation, so they can take time off to take care of their children, whether or members of the family that might have existing health conditions as well. Unfortunately, there have been women in our sector that have voluntarily left their jobs in order to take care of their family members as well. Mm-hmm. Organizations such as the Y have also offered additional pandemic days. So we've offered 10 additional pandemic days, so that, and this is in addition to the benefits of sick leave, etc., that many of them have, so that staff can take time off to take care of their children, themselves, or their family members if they've been impacted by the virus, or for childcare needs, etc. And we certainly would have, for example, offered the $4 wage enhancement that the province offered to the healthcare sector, but there have been certain positions that have not been funded. Despite that, I think to definitely ensure that there is equitable distribution of this, we've offered this wage enhancement to others. And we hope that this wage enhancement, which unfortunately was terminated by August 13th, I think, is reinstated, given that we are now in the current second wave of this pandemic as well. And we have also offered 10% additional salary to our essential services. Again, encouraging staff to take their vacation, which is a challenge in COVID times. Many of them have not been able to do that, or have obviously taken staycations, which means that they are still perhaps, checking their emails or responding to concerns and questions that might come up from their workplaces. Again, offering supports, very consistent supports and tools and resources, so that the mental health and emotional health of our staff can be taken care of, particularly when you're doing remote work. A number of our staff have felt isolated, and ensuring that they can take care of their emotional and mental health has really been important. Ensuring that there is work-life balance, despite the fact that there isn't, at least encouraging our staff to do so as well.
Thank you very much, Serene, for identifying and very thoroughly and presenting us very thoroughly the challenges that are faced by the organizations, by the staff, by the women that are served, by the people that are served by this organization. We can see really two themes, I guess, or two main issues. The one around being flexible, being empathetic to ensure the mental health of the staff, and their ability also to take care of others around them is possible. And in terms of the financial security, adding those $4 on the wage and all these things, right? It also certainly resonates with the audience. And it also has to remind us that it's not only the issues that women are facing in terms of wages. It's not only the pay gap. It's also actually more largely the wealth gap, because for those who have been forced for different reasons to stop in their work, there is not the possibility to access those emergency funds that we are sometimes pushed to put on the side, but because of the cost of life and those gaps and all these, the childcare cost and everything, it's very hard. So we have kind of a ripple effect actually coming from all this. So thank you very much for identifying all this. Cassandra, we're going west with you to British Columbia. What are you witnessing in these last months in your province? Brittany, you were talking when you touched the topic of childcare, for example, that there was a specific policy that was in March. Sorry for my English. Sometimes I just try to translate from French, but there are things that are implemented, and yourself, you're working more closely with the Indigenous people and with workers. So please tell us.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to take the time to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the unceded and otherwise occupied territories of the Musqueam, Tsimanis, Kwantlen, Sta'olo, Tsawwassen, and Katzie First Nations. And I say and otherwise occupied because there is a treaty that currently exists with the Tsawwassen First Nation, and Tsimanis is currently part of a negotiations process. As somebody who is a child of refugees, you know, I sympathize with you around language. Unfortunately, I don't speak French. The only colonial languages I speak are English and Spanish, and the indigenous languages that I'm learning right now are Halkomelem and Mapudungun. So when the pandemic hit the West Coast, it became very apparent very quickly that it hit some community members harder than others, particularly women, trans, non-binary people, and often within that group, young people, seniors, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and people with disabilities. The BC Fed held weekly meetings with the leaders of affiliate unions in the province to keep its finger on the pulse of what was happening in the industries. Workers in long-term care, who were predominantly women and workers of color, were faced with incredibly dangerous working environments. They were also no longer able to pick up shifts in multiple facilities to round out their hours, which was a precaution to stop the spread of COVID-19. Workers in the hospitality industry lost their jobs almost instantly and en masse, particularly in hotels and restaurants, which are industries with large percentages of women, recent migrants, and young people. Workers in the film industry were virtually completely out of work. Workers in grocery stores were suddenly being called essential by the federal government, but were not being compensated for the extra risk they were forced to take by going to work every day, or the abuse that they faced at the hands of the customers who weren't adjusting so well to the new physical distancing measures. Cleaners in hospitals, who had been undervalued and even mocked by our previous provincial government in the 90s and the early 2000s, were reacting to suddenly being called heroes, but again, not being compensated accordingly. Workers working from home, particularly women, were struggling with having to perform their work duties while also having to provide childcare, and in some cases, schooling for children also confined to the home. Reports of a huge surge in instances of sexual and domestic violence were and continue to be of a major concern. Migrant workers, particularly those employed in the agricultural stream of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program or the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, as mentioned by Brittany earlier, were facing outbreaks within their work teams as a result of having been exposed to COVID while in transit. Workers with precarious or no immigration status found themselves to be the first on the layoff list of their employers and also left out of any federal CERB money or at that time provincial financial compensation that was available to people who had lost their employment due to COVID-19. The same type of financial help that would have been available to permanent residents or citizens was not available to workers with no immigration status here in BC. Sex workers found themselves unable to work in hotels or motels and found themselves having to work in riskier settings, often without access to proper facilities to bathe or use the toilet before or after clients. And I should just clarify here that the BC Federation of Labor does recognize sex work as work. We believe that it is an industry that workers are performing their labor in, and it deserves to be protected as such. Indigenous communities experience the lack of ability to gather in their traditional, according to their cultural practices, in their traditional ways, and to send off their loved ones who had passed or to gather in ceremony. Elders were experiencing increased isolation, and many still are. Many Indigenous communities struggled with the recolonizing effect of asking visitors to their territories to respect their communities, to stay away, to not bring their sickness into their homelands, to save those crucial health resources that exist in those communities for the people of the and they were and still met with unacceptable violence and hatred at structural levels, at personal levels, at community levels. The murder of George Floyd, and almost immediately afterward, this suspicious police-involved death of Regis Kraczynski-Paquette, and shortly thereafter, the police killing of Chantel Moore during a wellness check, of all things, shone a spotlight on police violence against Black and Indigenous community members, which in turn forced society in BC as well to ask itself why police exist and whose interests they really serve. To summarize, we watched as the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic hit the shores of modern, colonial, patriarchal society and overturned every rock. It exposed every seedy underbelly of oppression that our current system tries to hide, and it did so while we were all forced to pay attention. So the question is now, what are we doing about it? The first thing the BC Fed did was work with community partners to hold an online panel on sexual and domestic violence in BC. The BC Fed continued to work on these issues, first with our President Laird Cronk being on the Premier's Economic Recovery Task Force, which served as an advisory body to government until July on economic recovery. The BC Federation of Labour made a formal submission to the Economic Recovery Task Force and a further equity addendum to that submission that talked about recommendations for recovery with an intersectional gendered lens. In determining the recommendations, we worked with stakeholders in each of these areas to come up with concrete recommendations that went to government to advise on how to move forward from the damage the pandemic did to working people in BC, and also to fix some of the systemic issues that have been plaguing the province since long before COVID. The recommendations focused on immediate, medium, and long-term solutions and followed the pillars of the work of our Women's and Gender Rights Committee of women's safety, women's economic security, and women in leadership. These documents have been made available for your reference here at the conference. Some of our affiliates, through working with our provincial government, were able to negotiate pandemic pay, which topped up frontline workers industries such as hospital workers, grocery store workers, community and social services, and long-term care. In long-term care specifically, the Hospital Employees Union was able to negotiate their full hours in one single site up to 1.3 times full-time employment. Funding was awarded by the provincial government to support sex worker-led organizations and to provide staffed facilities for sex workers to use. Emergency funding was provided to women's organizations and shelters responding home in our communities. All of these measures are great steps in the right direction, but what we really need is a system overhaul. Our patriarchal operating system is fried, and we need a motherboard, and not just a motherboard, but a collaborative system that includes women, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people, one that includes people with disabilities, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, all of the humans who make up our communities, as well as other species and the land, the trees, and our waterways. We need a recovery for all, a she-covery and a we-covery. Thank you.
And a she-covery and that's very strong, Cassandra. It's probably that you will be asked to share your notes if you don't mind by certain people of the audience or even by me, because I would really like to go over all the realities that you touched. We talked about the numbers with Lee. We talked about the realities, certain realities at the macroeconomical level, at the organizational level, and really with what you just shared now, we see the impact on people and in a very specific way in their everyday life, and how important it is to achieve it's difficult to say to take advantage, but what are we doing with this crisis? What are we doing with everything that is happening right now? I will come back definitely, Cassandra, to some of the point that you mentioned. Lee, Armin, we talked about those sectors, right? Those 5 C's that you also mentioned, Cassandra: caring, cashiering, catering, cleaning, clerical functions, how important it was also to have the rights of those workers fight for and recognize. What do you see moving forward? What do you want to see moving forward in terms of, let's say, future of work and the sectors, and what type of economy should we all fight for, right, starting now?
Maybe I can just jump in right into this. I think, as I already mentioned, that there are still lots of uncertainties, but for sure, some of the labor market impacts will be far-reaching. And also in the longer term, I also see some of the trends probably will get accelerated. For example, like digitalization, automation, and also, for example, like telework, right? So, but those trends are going to have very different impacts on different groups. As we see, women, like migrant workers, are represented in different sectors, different occupations, and those occupations actually are going to have very different, I would say, recovery paths to the pandemic. So, for example, like in September, as Armin already mentioned, we see some of the employment already came back. And also, for example, like from the accommodation, food services, we see definitely a great increase in terms of employment. But those jobs, I would say still, they are going to face ongoing uncertainties because, for example, we see right now, so some of the COVID restrictions are reintroduced in some of the provinces already. So, and also for some of the work that already right now are done from home, I would say for women, there's again ongoing challenge as well. So despite a recovery to a pre-pandemic employment level, also September numbers also show that it's taking longer for work absences to return to pre-pandemic levels for women. So in September, actually, so the number of mothers who worked less than half of their usual hours for reasons most likely related to COVID, like childcare or caregiving, was 70% higher than in February, compared to only like 24% for fathers. So that's a significant number. So it's especially like for working mothers. And also in terms of digitalization, I would also highlight maybe a fact that I think Catherine also highlighted, like women are most concentrated in some of the service and also clerical jobs. And so those jobs actually have higher automation risks. So in some circumstances, that may mean a requirement for reskilling and also upskilling. So, but again, so those needs also would require childcare services, because women, they cannot go for like training programs if they don't have necessary support for the childcare and or other caregiving responsibilities. So I just want to highlight still, I think that the path is still unclear for women, for some of the like migrant workers. So, and in terms of like in general, like the infrastructure, what we can do, there's a lot we can do. But of course, that's a big question actually for policy makers.
Armin, She-Covery, We-Covery, what is the path for a collaborative economy that we're starting to talk about?
Well, I hate to repeat this because there's an awful lot of women that don't have part of this story. But as you pointed out, I coined the term she session in March, and I coined the slogan, no recovery without a she-covery.
Yes.
No she-covery without childcare, I think by April. So of the tree of things that help us move forward, that is low-hanging fruit for everybody's benefit, it's childcare. And it's not just any form of childcare, it's early learning and childcare, because it packs a triple punch. It helps mommy get back to work, which maintains purchasing power in the economy, which means fewer businesses. More businesses have more customers, which is kind of critical to the story we're telling. It creates great jobs if that's the type of jobs we create, but that will have to be publicly subsidized because that isn't what the market has produced thus far. And it helps children reach their maximum potential, which will be critical in the years to come because of population aging. And because our highest fertility rates are amongst Indigenous populations and recent immigrants, not all of whom have English or French as their founding language. So they enter school, maybe not learning ready, certainly needing more support than a lot of other groups. And we're just watching this happen and doing nothing about it. So you see the childcare meets, and finally, just to underscore the importance of it, is the irony of all of this is that childcare pays for itself. It literally pays for itself. If we take the Quebec example, in 2008, there was a study that showed, in 2010, there was a study that showed that in 2008, for every $100 that the Quebec government put into subsidized childcare, it received an additional net new $103 in provincial income taxes. And the federal government that didn't put a thin dime into the program got $43, total windfall. So that was just in one fiscal year, but we also know that returns on investment accrue over the course of a life if we are talking about investing in early learning, not just getting mommy back to work, and improving the learning and consequently the future earning potential of all children. But I want to go back to the point that a lot of the jobs we're talking about aren't coming back, whether or not we have childcare. And we are going to go through a very, very difficult phase of seeing marginal small businesses not being able to rehire the people that they hired before, who tended to be low-paid workers, immigrants, etc., with the exception of the food sector. So Brittany mentioned agricultural workers, but the food sector, I mean, again, you look at the essential economy, what is it? You need a place to live, you need so you need to have enough money to pay your rent, you need to have enough food. So everything from planting the seeds to harvesting the food to shipping it to where people can buy it to preparing it, everything in the food industry and the food processing is not male dominated. When you take a look at the entire supply chain of how we get our food, it is pretty gender balanced and in fact skews towards women, but is all low paid and it's primarily immigrant. So a lot of that work will, the part that brings food to your house, to the grocery stores, but be underpaid. And a lot of the work that goes from grocery stores to the takeout, to the restaurant sector will disappear. Now, at some point after the pandemic, there will be a huge burst of startups again. But the period we are talking about that Brittany pointed to, that is going to require government supports is much longer than we originally thought. It is going to require a lot more income support. And whereas we are at a pivot point where we're going to have to start thinking about governments taking a bigger role in the economy, both planned and just simply keeping the damn thing afloat to the extent it can, there is going to be increasing noise from the other side saying that are all the people from the 1990s and the 1980s saying the best recovery is when the government gets out of the way and lets the market do its magic thing, just generating wealth. So we've got a big fight on our hands about actually meeting those needs that Sarang and Lee have pointed out that are fundamental, they're essential needs. Somebody has to do them. And we can't afford to do them and actually make all of these jobs great jobs. But there's such a fetishization of the role of markets in generating jobs and wealth that we have got on our hands a really big framing debate coming up, because one version of capitalism is ending right now as we speak because of the pandemic. Started with the global financial crisis, didn't go away, got worse, had the establishment economic institutions like IMF and World Bank and OECD and even our governments talking about the need for inclusive growth. Nobody said, what does that look like? And what it looks like is growing the economy from the bottom up, actually starting with the poorest paid workers and making sure every job is a great job. That's what it looks like. But nobody says that, right? Nobody talks about the role of unions and collective action. We are in a fight about individual resilience versus collective action. That's what the next few years is going to be about. And don't think it's going to be an easy thing because we've been living with it for half a century. Mm-hmm. So that conversation is not going to spin on a dime. And it's our job to make it clear that together we can actually build a better economic future, but we have to do it together. We can't do it one by one.
Thank you very much, Armin. Because you mentioned collective action, I would like to come back to Brittany and Cassandra, both very involved in social justice. What are your, I will not say advice, but how do you see the sectors you work with and for taking this role of collective action? Like what can we do to frame this new economy and make sure that it's inclusive, that it's just, that it's fair? It's going to be a tough fight, as Armin told us. What do you think we can do? Oh, your mic, please, Brittany.
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting.
Sure.
First, I do want to say thank you to Armin for acknowledging the fight that is happening right now and that will be happening over the next few years as it relates to government spending. And there are very clear lines being drawn at this moment in time in terms of who supports ongoing spending and supports, investments in income supports and investments that help to promote public health measures, investments to help support and protect workers, and those who do not think those investments are worth it. So the fight is absolutely occurring in this moment in time. A lot of the work that we've been doing at the Institute and what we will be doing moving forward is helping to, I would say, catch people up to speed in terms of how government financing works and the ability of the federal government to take on debt, but also, new tax measures that can be tapped into and that can be used to help fund and recover economically. So a lot of these new tax measures include anywhere from an excess profits tax, which works well in a pandemic like this one, where large corporations are reaping massive profits in a moment of crisis, which is not only unethical, but also unfair. But also, other tax measures such as, a wealth tax, or even continuing the work to crack down on tax avoidance and tax evasion, and also to close tax loopholes. Those are going to be really critical as we move forward and as we start to map out the federal government's financial plan, essentially, as we begin to recover from this pandemic. But in regards to, a lot of the work that should be required or is needed right now, I would say is to really focus on coalition building. Collective action will require the work of the service sector, which I'm so glad to see representatives here today, but also those who work within nonprofits, the think tank landscape that I'm working in right now, alongside activists and organizers, working directly with folks around specific issues. This will require massive amounts of, I would say, energy and organizing across sectors, and also people who work in different issues as well. So for example, tax measures or inducing new tax measures does have the interest of those who are working to implement childcare, those who are working to implement pharmacare, and those who are working to, have a greener and cleaner economy. So there are a lot of mutual interests here that a lot of people who are invested in having, a future that protects lives, but also invests in people, where all these interests can come together and begin to work together. So I would say coalition building is so crucial and important. And then also I want to point out to the fact that, infrastructure projects or spending in regards to infrastructure projects to jumpstart the economy will be important, but it's not going to be your traditional construction projects. And I think that's really clear. I think that should be important to point out, or we shouldn't be looking to advocate for your traditional construction or oil and gas projects. A lot of these projects should look to things like expanding school infrastructure. Our school buildings need to completely be revamped, as it relates to moving forward throughout this pandemic and into the future. What should classrooms look like? How should buildings be ventilated? How many teachers will now be required to ensure, a safe amount of people can gather in a room? That's the sort of infrastructure creativity that needs to be brought to the forefront right now. For example, our transit systems is another key example of that. What do we need to do to build transit systems that allow for people to be in these systems, but also that respects and adheres to environmental principles that we should be integrating? So I think around reimagining what our infrastructure projects should look like moving forward as it relates to the pandemic that we're in and the public health crisis that we're in, and how spending should help shape that, and what jobs can be brought among within that. Two founding pillars of our new economy will be the caring economy and will be the green economy. So we really need to think about ways that we can ensure that people can participate in those two sectors, and then how we can ensure that good jobs are created from that.
Well, thank you very much, Brittany. Cassandra, collective action, it's at the core of the existence of union involving the workers. How do you see that going?
Absolutely. So there are kind of three types of collective action that I see happening in BC. There is community-based grassroots collective action that centers the people whose voices are often left out as the leaders of the movements. And so when I think of those movements, I think of the amazing work that Black Lives Matter is doing in BC. I think about the amazing work of the BC Civil Liberties Association. I think about some of the community partners that we work with at the Federation on particular issues. So for example, for sexual and domestic violence, we work a lot with Angela Marie McDougall from Battered Women Support Services. We worked with Mabrat Bayen from WISH Drop-In Center Society, Heather Smith from Atira Women's Support Services. We worked with WAVA, we worked with EVA BC, and those are kind of organized labor's community partners that we collaborate with. We sit on the Coalition on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in BC, and so we try to stay grounded and accountable to community in that way. And then you have the internal collective action of our affiliates and their membership around the issues that affect their workplaces. Some of the ways in which community has risen to respond to the gaps in the social infrastructure protecting certain workers who are in our communities, for example, are with respect to workers without status or community members without status, Sanctuary Health Vancouver and the Centro Acción Comunitaria, which is the Community Action Center, are coordinating to bring emergency food donations, emergency funding donations to community members who were laid off by their employers, were not able to pay their rent and were fearing not paying their rent because that would, of course, open the door to their landlord possibly reporting them and leading to immigration detention, those types of things. We've also participated for the last almost 3 years in its varying formats in the Migrant Worker Support Network, which is a pilot project that was created by the ESDC and the IRCC and tested here in British Columbia. The pilot project brings together workers who are migrant workers under the low wage stream of the temporary foreign worker program. It brings together employers, it brings together ISS, so immigrant support services societies. It brings together foreign consulates and all levels of government. So civic, federal, provincial, government officials from multiple ministries. And that in and of itself is a different type of coalition that we have experienced in BC. And I can say that some of the challenges that arise from having in effect, a coalition that is led by federal government, it's facilitated by federal government, and it is by numbers at this point, heavily biased toward employers and ISS services, which means that the workers' voices and the voices of their advocates and the organizations that represent them can sometimes be drowned out, which has meant that instead of getting permanent residency upon arrival as a formalized recommendation coming out of that group, we got something that was legislatively a much weaker version. And so I think at this point, the most important types of coalitions that we can support and uplift and uphold are the types of coalitions that are led by the people who have agency over the issue and the people who are experiencing marginalization at the hands of a system that was built specifically to exclude them and to abuse them.
Yes, thank you. So in this coalition or collective action, Brittany and Cassandra, from what I hear, we can definitely see that the market is not involved, even though the market is at the core of all of this, and the change that has to happen. At Zering, you are working with these employers, training, retraining women, for example, is really one of the action that you do as director of employment and training programs. What are the challenges that you see yourself in rebuilding this economy where immigrant and refugee women can truly belong? And this word of belonging is important for you, I think.
Thank you, Faiza. So I must say I agree with Armin and Brittany's concept that this is not the time for austerity measures. Absolutely not the time for that. And so the call upon, the governments particularly to have a stabilization fund to support core infrastructure cost of organizations, not-for-profit organizations, women's organizations, I think is critical at this time. And I think this call has been coming from other umbrella organizations, other charitable foundations such as Imagine Canada, ONN, and we would certainly hope that that's something that the government can do. The opportunity to perhaps subvert traditional gender roles that shape women's work. So for example, governments need to put in more supports in place, both in terms of education and workplace supports to help women enter into skilled trades and tech fields. The Ontario province does support some of these programs. They have not had a call for proposal as yet for the new fiscal next year. And again, just ensuring that those skilled trades, those IT trainings and programs and fields where there will be a shortage of labor to ensure that women are funded for those kind of programs as well. Stronger labor laws, which would focus the hands of employers to create more equitable labor conditions so that they can benefit women as well as those, especially who may be working from home or as well. And then in the province of Ontario, a call to the Ministry of Labour, Trade and Training and Skills Development that oversees the Employment Ontario Transformation Services to actually consider and recognize that women are a specialized priority demographic group, just as they have considered youth, people with disabilities, newcomers, francophone and Indigenous persons. I think women need to, especially in this pandemic era, to consider women as a specialized group to support them for employment services as well. In terms of, I just was thinking in terms of challenges, I think one of the concerns for women's organizations is that if there is no sustained funding, particularly smaller organizations and not-for-profit organizations with different funding models, there is a danger that they might belly up and close. So really a concern that organizations that have been offering critical community services, essential services, may be closed if sustained funding does not continue as well. And then I think the digital divide, I've already spoken about that and its implications in terms of safeguarding the gains that we've made to advance general gender equality. The job losses that Lee was earlier talking about, especially in the sectors of hospitality, retail, food services, and tourism, and that Armin mentioned, is very likely that they will not return back or will be at a much slower rate. Just really making sure that those workers in those sectors either are reskilled, are upskilled where necessary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Serene. Thank you all for the different issues that we already covered. We're gonna go through now some questions that we're having from our audience. We still have 30 minutes to cover questions from the audience, question also from other panelists that are joining us and asking and wanting to hear from you on different topics. So for the audience, please take the Q&A, ask your questions. That's the moment for you to share doubts, comments. It's heavy. We can see it's complex. It's going to require a lot of different actions to be taken almost in parallel. There is a question from Rosemary Legge from Fort Erie, a multicultural center. Rosemary, forgive me if it's Legge. So your question is around housing. So you say, I agree that a national childcare policy is needed, but I'm also wondering about how a national policy with regards to low-income subsidized housing could help or play a role in a successful She-Covery. Who would like to take this question? Brittany, Armin? Maybe. Brittany, you were already reacting, I think. Please.
Yeah, I'll briefly mention it and I'll just pass it over to Armin. And the National Housing Strategy is still in operation. And the government recently did announce the construction of affordable housing, new affordable housing. A lot of the units are in Toronto, but what I do know is that the National Housing Strategy is currently being revamped to, I would say, reflect our COVID-19 realities. So I would say absolutely that low-income affordable housing is crucial to the safety and well-being of women, but also easing financial burdens as well. And I think that's an excellent point. And I think our sights should continue to be set on that.
Mm-hmm. Armin, any thoughts on housing?
Well, I guess it just seems like one of those brain dead things to do, right? Like it's
obvious.
There's shovel ready projects everywhere and people need housing. And I guess the big story is how much of the money we will spend will go to housing vouchers or housing benefits, which is another way of dealing with the lack of affordability and what that does to the market. and whether without rent control, whether it just goes in one pocket and out the other to landlords. So what we've done is create effectively just an enormous redistribution system from the taxpayer to the landlord. So we've got some issues to tackle, because some of the problem is lack of decent supply, and some of it is simple unaffordability because so many people have lost so much work. So I don't know how we're going to thread this needle, but certainly more action on housing is like a no-brainer. That's the biggest bite out of any household's budget, is for shelter. And that's whether you're rich, poor, or middle class. It's the single biggest bite out of our household income. So something's going to give for an awful lot of people.
Yeah,
Yes.
can I also just touch on that? Thank you for raising the housing benefit point. I mean, so there was a huge, policy discussions throughout COVID, well, for the first, I would say, 6 months of this pandemic, around whether a housing benefit should be issued alongside CERB or any other form of financial relief as well. And that didn't necessarily come into fruition on the federal level, but BC does have a housing tax credit that it looks like they'll be continuing, because the BC NDP has remained the governing party. So that will be available to residents in that province. So when it comes to housing benefits, the responsibility has largely been shifted towards provincial governments. In Ontario, we do now have a rent freeze, which is, I know it's minimal, but it's something that does help to stabilize costs. And there's still a lot of advocacy efforts in regards to whether a financial benefit would be essential in this point in time. So I just kind of want to set the context in terms of where we are at. And Acorn Canada, but also their provincial chapters, have been really instrumental in advocating for some sort of financial housing benefit relief. So I would say stay up to date on a lot of the work that they're doing, because they have gotten some big wins in BC, as you've seen, and they're continuing their work across the country.
Can I just jump on this for a second, Faiza, because
Please.
a housing benefit would make a huge difference in people's lives, for sure, in particularly low income people's lives. But I want to be super clear that it can also lead to just lining the pockets of landlords. And we can't have a housing benefit. The only way we prevent that is by having rent control, and we are not going to get rent control in 4 conservative provinces. There's just no way. 1 or 2 provinces may introduce rent control. It's always beaten back by the landlords. It comes and it goes. So I think we need to be very mindful of the need to both help people that are at the risk of losing their homes, and who it is we ultimately help, and who we're asking to take the big haircut as a result of COVID, because these rich landlords and the bulk of, there was a great piece out of the CCPA that David McDonald did. No, I guess it was Ricardo Tronjan did the piece for CCPA about who are the landlords. By and large, they're not mom and pop, they're not little landlords. They're huge, huge companies. And so actually sharing the pain is not a bad idea, but you have to be conscious of where this money's going to when you do help low income people. And I will wrap my thought very quickly by saying that we do need to organize for better, and we are very likely to see a tsunami of household debt from renters that are potentially going to get evicted, and less of concern are actually mortgage foreclosures, though that's also a concern. But when we talk about the people we've been talking about today, we're looking at a wave of people that might get evicted, and you can only forestall rents for so long. Now, then what do you do, right? Then you have a wall of unpayable debt. So that's the shoe that hasn't dropped yet with COVID. We are looking at a wall of debt, both commercial and household debt, and it is unpayable. So we are going to be looking at money in a very different way in a couple of years.
Yeah, very much. 2 numbers probably to follow up with what you just said, Armin. Canada is by far one of the most in-debt country in terms of the debt that is carried by its household. It's for Toronto, for Vancouver, we're talking about more than $2 that is owed for every dollar that is earned. I also seen a few days ago a study coming out of FP, Financial Planner Association, saying that 1 out of 3 people in Canada won't be recovering financially in terms of personal finance, their finances, the household finance from this crisis. So definitely something to look at. And real estate, housing, construction is also a huge part of the GDP. I mean, you were mentioning the importance of those GDP measures. So it is kind of a vicious circle that we have to go out of, and where to start. You mentioned provincial government, so that's the second question that we have from the audience. Is this the time to bring in employment equity legislation by provincial governments, similar to the federal government's policy? So that's a policy question. Cassandra, I've seen you touch your mic.
Sure. I'm happy to just say that absolutely, I think it's one of the only ways that we can encourage all sides of the economy in a province to play ball for what is needed for all of the people in a province is to legislate it. And so we were lucky enough in BC to just re-elect an NDC government. It looks like we have a majority government, which means that there should be nothing infrastructurally standing in the way of this type of legislation being passed in our province forthwith. And I think it's the best thing that can happen for working people for the majority of British Columbia.
Someone else want to add something around this question of employment equity at the provincial level? Yes, Tsering, please.
I just wanted to add that I think definitely pay equity is a really important piece of legislation. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, when I was in the earlier session with the funders panel, I think that question came up as well. And I think the response that I heard was that that's the work of perhaps the employers who are employing, the individuals. But again, as a women's organization, I think pay equity is critical. We know that pay equity is not there right now for many sectors, and I would certainly say that this legislation needs to be pushed forward.
Yeah, regarding pay equity, we actually have since last year a commissioner around pay equity. The last discussion that she had was she was saying that the legislation at the federal level is ready, but because of COVID, it has been pushed aside a bit. So let's see what at the federal level at least will be done next year, early next year, for this legislation about pay equity. Pay equity narratives tend to ignore race, disability, and that's a follow-up from one person of the audience. That's the case, right? We usually talk about pay equity in the normal, like women in general, but when we go in the details of race, of gender, of disability, we see gaps that are like 42 to 1, for example. Lee, maybe you've seen that in the statistics. You showed us also some things around that, around the financial vulnerability. What could you add around pay equity and the fact that it ignores visible minorities, reality, indigenous people realities?
Yeah, I think like this pay gap, I would say, or pay inequality actually is kind of like a long-lasting issue for Canada, I think so. And also from our statistics, actually, we don't have a good understanding in terms of how those small groups actually are doing in terms of a pay gap. So as the comment already said, so for specific visible minority groups, we don't know how much this is an issue. And just recently, StatsCan just added the visible minority indicator to the labor force survey. Actually, we can have a timely tracking of this issue. And so and also for Indigenous people, that's another long-lasting issue as well. So in terms of a national statistic system, again, so due to different reasons, we don't have a good or complete system to track the information. And also, I would like to add a little bit nuance actually to this diversity or like the inclusion part. So sometimes we also ignore the family status of various groups. For example, like the number of children and also the multi-generational like families and also their living, like even the housing situation. That's another thing. So I think in our like the data or even the evidence or analysis, we need to also consider those diversity, I would say, so or like actual barriers actually to addressing the pay inequality, I would say.
Cassandra, you would like to add to this point?
Yeah, and I just want to highlight a point that Brittany made earlier, which was that people who are marginalized by the system need to be included in any process. And so when we talk about the reality that exists that pay equity legislation has in the past left people out, particularly people of marginalized socioeconomic status, it's because often they were left out of the creation of that legislation. And so pay equity legislation done well will include all of the people who are traditionally left behind in the creation of that legislation, which will serve more to reflect their needs in an equitable policy moving forward.
Thank you. I actually do have a question for you. We talked about employees. I would like you probably to add or to speak about entrepreneurs, and especially because these last years we've seen a huge push towards marginalized group, visible minorities in terms of training, in terms of direction to tell them start businesses. We're here to support, and so on and so on. And most of them are self-employed. So how do you see them recover from this situation? We talk about employees, not enough about entrepreneurs, not even just small businesses, but entrepreneurs that are carrying the weight of their lives on their own shoulders. Someone? Zering, maybe, because you do have this type of trainings at the YWCA. What about the entrepreneurs?
So certainly, I think it's a really important group of workers, I would say self-employed. We haven't really spoken a lot about them. I think it's really critical because I think I don't have the data, but I think majority of small entrepreneurs are definitely women-led. So obviously this pandemic has had an impact on them. They may have had to close, as we were talking about earlier. I mean, mentioned salons closing, all these smaller, enterprises closing. This has certainly had an impact on women. And, government supports definitely really would be critical for them at this time, is what I would say at this particular stage.
Documenting their realities is probably very important. They were left outside of a lot of the policies or the support that has been developed this last month. I'll come back for the last question before we wrap up to you. Lee, you made a lot of effort to gather information. I think you actually have a question for the audience, for the other panelists around the priority information gap that Statistic Canada could help fill out now.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like an ongoing priority question. So whenever StatsCan is presenting something, we would also like to ask this question. So what StatsCan, as the National Statistical Agency, actually we can do to address some of the information gaps to, for example, to inform the decision making. So this is pretty general, but I think it's also very relevant. I think also will be very important for StatsCan to improve our data and also analytical programs.
Yes, so the request is launched, I guess, Lee, to the panelists, but also to the different and various organizations that are watching this discussion today. So in terms of data collection, analysis, data integration, really Statistic Canada is doing this work. Lee, you are leading this work. So I guess we can just email you our questions, the need that we have, right? Okay, that's what it is. Yes, Darren, please.
I just wanted to add, I think the disaggregation of data is critical. I think, Lee, you have really given some excellent, analysis of female versus male, disaggregated data. But I think we really need to go further, race, class, all these intersectionalities that we have, because that complexities and those nuances will then give us a better picture of some of the issues that we've been talking about. So I really would appreciate a disaggregation of data, further data. There is some data that is not, again, disaggregated, even male versus female, but further disaggregated data would really be appreciated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and myself, for example, as a French speaker, and especially living in a minority, like outside of Quebec, we are a minority community speaking French, and I will follow your point, Cassandra, when you were talking about colonizing languages. I'm from Algeria, and French, my first language, is a heritage of colonization moment in history. We have a lot of issues in identifying the needs of our population and our different groups coming from different countries, not always mentioning actually French as their first language, but they will choose something else. So two questions, one question, I believe. How do we get Stat Canada to move away from language of visible minority and speak of people of color or rationalized people? Language is important, words are important. What do you think?
I think, definitely. When it comes to terminology or language, actually, so like even within StatsCan, we've had different debates. But also probably you understand like within federal government, we do have our certain rules to obey. So far, visible minority groups are the language we are using, but also we are recognizing there are some, I would say, concerns about the language and also the exclusion this language may pose. So I just want to let you know, actually, there are ongoing discussion, and also possibly there will be change to this language in particular.
Mm-hmm. Cassandra, around language, you have something to share.
I was just suggesting that allowing respondents to fill out the census in the language that they need to have access to could go a long way to having more responses, closing some of those data gaps. Another gap for us in community that we have access to through census responses are until 2016, there was no way to measure how people who how trans people were faring in the labor market. And so that's one thing that has been fixed on future censuses and since 2016. But there are other gaps that exist, particularly based aggregate data on a multitude of different issues with respect to victims of crimes, with respect to gender-based violence, with respect to household income, education level. Those are all things that we would want to be able to have access to in community. And I think I'll leave it there for now because I think other people are also wanting to jump in.
Thank you, Cassandra. So a debate definitely around the languages and around the language, the word, a debate, a discussion to be followed. Most probably a comment in the chat is that the UN has said to Canada in various reports that they need to move away from that language. So the visible minority mention the word. So let's see. We arrive at the end of this discussion. I would like to take the 8 next minutes, maybe the 5 next minutes, to offer you the possibility to wrap up, to conclude with a sentence or two, each one of you, maybe trying to finish on a positive note, if this is how you feel, or something that hasn't been touched that you want to leave the audience with. And then Debbie, we will ask you to join us again to conclude. Who wants to start with 1 or 2 sentences? Brittany?
I'll start. And I do want to say, on a more optimistic note, I've been feeling really hopeful in regard to the changes that have been made to income supports. At the start of COVID, knowing that CERB was further expanded at the beginning of the pandemic to include those who maybe did not have a certain amount of hours to access income support benefits was great. And even the extension of CERB that is now been created into 2 new programs, EI and the Canada Response Benefit. I'm glad to see those continue to exist. I'm really hopeful around conversations in regards to social assistance rates in provinces across our country, and determining and also coming to the longstanding position that those rates are inadequate, and what we all can do to help ensure that everybody has a minimum amount of, I would say, money for folks to live off of. So I do want to end on a more in terms of the gains that have been made over these last 7 months, and how that is contributing to what I would say the creation of a more fair, equitable, and just society.
Thank you, Brittany. Tsering?
I would certainly echo what I heard at the keynote speaker panel, I think on Tuesday, where Professor Powell talked about universality, but especially targeted universality. And I think is really relevant in this context and the discussion we are having here today. I really want to see and hope that there is gender balance and intersectional representation. I think both have to go together when there's any kind of discussion about economic recovery as well.
Thank you.
And I'm hoping that co-creation, we were talking about collaboration, but co-creation and the sense of belonging that we had, I was so, moved by in Professor Powell's presentation, that can certainly be seen, happening on the ground level as well.
Hopefully, yes. Thank you. Cassandra?
Thank you. I think what is sitting with me right now is the reality that when we craft a recovery strategy that puts equity at the forefront, we do more than just address the fallout from this recent pandemic, that policy decisions and investments we recommend here as workers, as coalitions that are grassroots and led by people who have traditionally been marginalized by society, by centering these people in policy decisions and investments, we can make our communities stronger and more resilient in the face of future pandemics that are possible. If we put the work in now, we can truly build an economy that works for everyone. We're already seeing it happen in BC. It's taking shape, and more grassroots community leaders are involved at policy creation tables. And so I'm incredibly hopeful for that trend. And I hope that it is something that continues, at least, and that spreads across the rest of Turtle Island.
Thank you very much for these words. Lee, and I will finish with Arlene. Lee?
Yeah, I just want to maybe highlight again, like a fact, actually. So we talk about all the like the barriers and also the overrepresentation of different groups in, I would say, disadvantaged groups. But also, on the other hand, I would like to also highlight that actually, so for example, like women are more likely than men to hold a university degree. And also like recent immigrants actually are overrepresented in like a university educated population. So if we can provide the support actually to help them get their talent used or fully used, I think we are looking at like a better future for them.
Strong message. Armin, you started this conversation around She-Covery. In 1 minute, how would you like to conclude this discussion with us?
I would like to conclude this discussion by saying that shift happens, and it's happening right now. Shift is happening. I look at this the people I can see are not in the audience, but Debbie Douglas and OCASI have brought together the most remarkable coalition of women here on my little palette, and talking about co-creating a future. I can just feel the change happening, and the role of women, powerful women, in seeing that the door is now a little bit ajar, and we are not going to bang it down. We are going to stride in with our full beauty and co-create something new in a new room. And God damn it, the economy is going to be a better place because of us. Thank you for making me understand how we are co-creating together, what we need together, and what we need to do to bring everybody with us. And it hasn't that always been our clarion call.
Thank you very much, Armin. Debbie, last words for you.
Thank you so much. There's nothing else to add. What a wonderful way to end. This has been a brilliant, informative, provocative table. I am so glad that you accepted our invitation. I know that your audience have had a wonderful 2 hours, new learnings, leaving with a sense of optimism. Armin, I'm striding through that door right with you. We're walking proud as women. We're going to co-create the Canada that we want to see. A brilliant job as a moderator. Thank you to all of our panelists. Have a great afternoon. And if you still want another meeting, please join us at 3 p.m. for our annual general meeting. And thank you to our funders, IRCC, Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, and United Way of Greater Toronto. Thank you all. And thank you to our audience for your questions and your participation. See you at 3 p.m.
Merci. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.